Today's video is going to be something truly exciting. It will be on how to paint rocks. That's right, rocks. A lot of them. Because sometimes you might have to do a landscape like this where there's lots and lots of little rocks to paint. Anyhow, my name is Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how I did all the rocks in the current painting that I'm working on. More specifically, the rocks that are further in the distance, like these right here. But I promise I'll make another video on how I did the ones more up close. This is the main photo I used for my landscape painting. And as you can see, there's definitely a lot of rocks. When I picked this photo, believe it or not, I actually liked how they looked. And I knew it was going to be a challenge to depict all those little pebbles. There are several different sections of interest. This is the first one, which is the furthest in the distance. If you notice, they're not very detailed in the photo and they're very blurry. And that soft blurry look is something I depicted in the painting as well to give it a sense of depth and distance. Because the ones that are slightly closer, like right here, are going to be more defined. And because of the difference in detail from the rocks in the back and the rocks right here, it'll help create the illusion of depth, especially when it comes to the rocks that are even closer to the viewer. But there's a lot more that went into those, so I will save that for another video. Besides just painting some rocks, there are also some plants that I have to depict as well, which leads to always plan what you do first. And it makes sense to do the rocks and gravel first and then paint the plants on top, especially since the plants are in front of gravel and are sticking out from the ground. And lastly, it will be the difference of how I depicted the rocks in the light as well as the dark. But on a serious note, there are different tones and temperatures of colors that I use to distinguish the difference between the two different sections here. Also, let's talk about the line of division that you see right here. That line of division is where the light meets the dark. No, seriously, this is a very crucial point in the painting, and it will help with the illusion of the texture on the ground right here, especially with some of the rocks sticking out. Plus, the ground is not completely even, so the shadow that is casted is actually not that straight. I drew this line here to demonstrate that, and you can see there's some imperfections, and it's not completely straight, and that is something I'm going to try to depict in the painting. Anyhow, enough talking. Let's get to the demonstration, shall we? I start off by laying out lines and bodies of color. I'm definitely not doing any detailing right now. My main focus is to set up the composition. This video is about painting rocks, but there are other objects in the painting, such as a bus and a truck, a sign, oh, and some dogs. Let's not forget about them. But I also wanted to establish where the shadow and light meet, especially since the vehicles are cast in big shadows. These simple shapes and lines and bodies of color will eventually be worked on, kind of like a block of rock that you chisel away and create a sculpture, but with paint. After establishing the composition, I first begin working in the very back, and slowly I work my way to the front. There are some rocks and gravel in the far distance, but to give the painting a sense of depth, this section will have the least detailed rocks, but instead, it will be just an impression that the ground is covered with lots of little stones. Plus, when you depict shadows and shade, pay attention to the temperature of the color. Throughout the painting, I have different tones for different sections. That one casted shadow in the far distance is pretty pale, and I use cerulean blue for it. But there are others in the painting that I use different colors, such as cobalt blue, French ultramarine, or my favorite dark tone, alizarin crimson with viridian. Yes, doing the rocks and gravel in the back was definitely not that difficult. So now time to do the rocks that are going to be mostly in the shade right here, which happen to be closer to the viewer. I painted the background first. That way I can lay down and paint what's behind the rocks. Remember, most of the time it makes sense to work your way from the back to the front, but not always. But in this scenario, it makes sense. I start to lay out dark blues. The shadow that was being casted by the truck and bus was definitely on the cooler side, and I wanted to emphasize on the blues. At this stage, it's not about detail. It's about covering as much ground as possible with big bodies of color. Little details will come later, of course. But since these rocks are more in the distance, The detail will not be sharp and on the blurry side, plus they are in the shade. So the goal is to still try to make them recede, especially when they are up against the rocks that will be in the front. Now, in order to build the illusion of lots of little rocks and pebbles, I used a variety of different brushes. Some were just simple rounds, but I even used some older brushes that were frayed, with hairs that go in different directions. Though I did not copy the photo exactly, especially the boost in blue, but I used it as a reference to kind of get the pattern of the rocks on the ground, especially all the different lights and darks. The goal was to lay out a pattern of them, dry brush to soften the foundation of paint that I laid, and then lay more colors of lights and darks, and then dry brush again, of course. One of the most important things I tried to do is the transition from light to dark. The shadows that are casted by the vehicles are not sharp. Also, the gravel on the ground is not even. Some rocks are bigger than others and stick out. Because of this, I carefully looked at the reference photo to spot these discrepancies and in a way depict them. Plus, there was a slice of light that cut through the two vehicles. My goal was to try to capture these little details in order to make the painting more believable. You'll start to notice that painting gravel or lots of little rocks on the ground is quite a repetitive process. So let's speed to the next section. I began to use a fan brush, and honestly I do not like to use them since sometimes they could give out a repetitive looking pattern, but I had to cover lots of ground and I was forced to use it. But I used different angles in order to make the application look more unique each time, and then the goal was to paint over it again after dry brushing, of course. In this scenario, I tried to work from the back to the front, building up the gravel and making the rocks more in the back have a softer, more blurry look, and the ones in the front a little less blurry and soft. But I also tried to increase the contrast gradually as I would get closer and closer to the viewer. I don't want to bore you with painting lots of little rocks, so let's speed through this section. Anyhow, in order to save time, it's very helpful to try to focus on one particular color that you see throughout the area. Periodically, I switch from lights to darks. Preferably, it's best to lay out your middle tones first, then afterwards do the extreme darks and then the extreme lights. This rule is not written in stone, but it is very helpful and definitely highlights, if there are any, at the very end. But throughout the whole process, I do dry brush when necessary. It is a very repetitive process, but if you want the illusion of gravel and rocks, it's necessary. Anyhow, let's slow down now and focus on a little bit of detail. This is in the background and in the shade too. But that doesn't mean not to depict individual rocks, just specific ones that stand out in the photo. These individual rocks are very key and crucial because they will help break the repetitive pattern that you just painted. Nothing too detailed. If anything, I'm making sure I dry brush them so they have a softer touch and recede in the background. But regardless, this will help establish the illusion that there's different sized rocks and make it appear more random as well. To give the rocks shape, I simply use lights and darks. Even though there's not much of a light source, there is reflective light. I just observe the photo very carefully and then use lights and darks to shape out the rocks. Anyway, let's speed to the next section. As you can see, I'm continuing to work from the back to the front. And now I have stepped into the light, or should I say I'm just working on the rocks that are in the light. Again, to speed up the process, I am using a fan brush in order to cover as much ground as possible and speed up the process of producing the illusion of lots of little pebbles and rocks. And since these are in direct sunlight, I will treat them different from the ones in the shade. One, because they're closer to the viewer, but the second will definitely be the color, at least the tones. They will definitely be warmer, but since the light is so intense, there will be more contrast as well. The process is practically the same. Lay out a pattern of colors, dry brush, build on top, dry brush a little more, and possibly detail a few rocks. And like before, try to use middle tones first, and then work your way to extreme darks and lights, with the highlights towards the end. While doing the section in the bright light, I'm also stepping into the shade here and there too. Again, the shadows that are casted are not perfectly straight. The gravels and rocks makes the shadow that is casted more rough and jagged. That border where the light and dark meet is very crucial, especially for creating the illusion of rocks on the ground. For that reason, I carefully paint those sections, both the one closer to the viewer and the one further in the back. While doing this, I'm also stepping back here and there and also observing the photo, not only to see what color the rocks are, but mimic a pattern to give the illusion of lots and lots of rocks. So I continue to paint, slowly building up layers and layers of pattern that will mimic the gravel on the ground. But in this area, it's not just rocks that I have to paint. There is also other plants as well as grass. But it made sense to lay the foundation of all the rocks on the ground first, and then paint the plants over it. Most are not going to stand out because they are also in the shade, but this will add to the realism of how plants, grass, and even weeds can find a way to grow even through gravel on the ground. Now time to slow down the footage a bit again to show how I created some of these plants. If you're painting a terrain full of rocks on the ground, I'm confident you might have to paint some grass or other plants too. I begin by painting the plants by using some of the middle tones, which just by chance happen to be slightly darker. They are in the shade after all. Then I start to introduce some of the brighter greens. I'm not sure what kind of plants they are, but I do my best to try to depict them the way they look in the photo. I do this towards the end because it's easier to paint them over the rocks versus trying to paint lots of rocks around the plants. Here and there, I'm also still working on the rocks, especially in order to create the illusion that they are sticking out from the ground and not just hovering in midair, but planted into the ground. No pun intended. Always think of the order of the layers before you start painting an area. That is also why the dog in the right is also incomplete. I will definitely paint him later. If anything, check out my YouTube short that I made of him. Link will be in the description. While I'm painting the plants, I am still dry brushing. I am still trying to make sure that they recede in the background, therefore they should have a softer touch. But I'm also trying to use brush strokes to depict the leaves. I'm not exactly trying to paint each leaf, but give the impression that there's many. If this plant was closer to the viewer, I would definitely be more detailed. Anyhow, let's fast forward to the next section, which is the border between the light and dark. As the title suggests, this is a video about painting rocks, but if there's anything I want to say is if you do see some plants or grass, don't be afraid to include them. They will just add to the level of realism. As mentioned before, this is very important to give the illusion of not only rocks on the ground, but how bumpy or flat the terrain could be. Anyhow, I already established some base colors, both for the side that's in the shade and also in the bright light. But right now, the thing that I focus on the most are detailing specific rocks, especially the ones in the middle. Again, I'm not copying the photo 100%, but I'm picking and choosing specific rocks. No, I'm not placing them exactly where I see them. My whole goal right now is to create a realistic, believable border where the shade and light meet. Besides just detailing some of the rocks, you also have to try to integrate colors from both sides. In order to accomplish this, I'm using some of the colors from the light side to create a pattern of rocks in the shade. I'm also doing the same for the light side, where I'm grabbing some of the colors from the shade in order to create a pattern of rocks there too. The goal is to make the border from light to dark appear seamless. Anyway, let's wrap up this video. Painting gravel or lots of rocks on the ground can be very tedious. It requires a lot of repetition of laying out patterns of color, dry brushing, and then laying out more patterns of color. And then don't forget, it never hurts to detail a few rocks here and there, and to pay attention to other things such as plants, grass, and in my case, dogs. Lastly, also consider the process to be full of trial and error. You might have to keep working the gravel with different colors or brushes until you're getting the pattern and texture of the ground that matches the photo. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. I made a few, but the goal is to keep on painting and pushing forward. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it, and hopefully you found this video helpful. There will be probably a time where you will be looking at photos or landscapes, and maybe you will shy away because of all the rocks and gravel in the painting. But if you like the scenery, go for the challenge. It never hurts to try. Anyhow, for more of my work, check out my Instagram, Not Your Typical Painter of course, or my Etsy shop. Links will be in the description. I still have a lot more work to do on this painting, and I have to correct a lot of things, such as this dog right here. So until next time, bye for now.